Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you. Featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. Today my guest is Anita Hyman, who has a background in the arts, and she has a husband who was a veterinarian as well. But when they met, they had a lot in common. He was interested in sculpture, she was interested in paintings and drawings, and that led them to a very interesting discovery. So in 1992, the opportunity arose to go to Cuba. A friend who had a fish business, of all things, in Cuba asked them if they would like to go. Both world travelers and curious said, of course, why not? So last but not least, their first trip began in 1992. It was the time that the Soviets left Cuba and left it in a mess. Anita Hyman is going to tell you what was so interesting about Cuba and all of the artists that they met. So I want to welcome to my show Anita Hyman.
Good morning, Susan. Thank you for having me.
You know, Anita, let's start from the beginning. First, I think people need to know a little bit about the history of Cuba. Cuba, I remember, and I was a very little girl, that an uncle of mine used to visit Cuba all the time, and it was really the place to go. So tell our audience a little bit about what happened to Cuba.
Well, there was, let's go back to, say, 1959, maybe a little bit before, when the revolution occurred. America was kind of a playground for Cuba. They had gambling shows, and that was a major attraction. It was a nice place, a weekend to go to. But it had its problems. Batista was in control of the island, and the people were getting very upset with it and wanted change. And that's when basically Fidel Castro and his brother basically created the revolution and took over the government. I believe it was January 1, 1959 on New Year's Day. So that was the beginning of it. Yeah. Then, of course, those people who are my age will also remember the Kennedy administration and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy put in place an embargo. And it's been in place, and actually the embargo is still in place today, although things are happening where things are opening up where they want to get rid of the embargo. I don't know what the Trump administration is going to do, but when Obama was president, they did exchange embassies again. So there is now an American embassy in Cuba today. Mm-hmm. So the relationships started to change between the two countries. And I just hope that in the future, because I know the island people want it. They want the embargo lifted totally.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what Cuba's like. A lot of people are reading now that Cuba is really the place to go. And it because of its history and because of the things that have happened, it's kind of like in another time. People tell me that there are cars that are like in the 1950s, and everything looks a little disheveled too, but still it's supposed to be so very beautiful in so many ways, and the people are supposed to be great too. So I want you to describe what it's like.
Well, it is you're correct on both accounts as far as going back in time. It does look like it just stopped still in the 50s. Certainly the cars are, now it's very prestigious if a Cuban owns one of those cars. If they have the money, they refurbish them, but they're not, they would not be considered antique cars in this country because the mechanics of the cars probably have been bastardized many times over with tractor parks and that kind of stuff. However, they are brightly painted. They're magenta and white. They're orange and white. The upholstery is generally stark white, and tourists love them. I mean, this is another way for a Cuban to earn extra money, is to have them ride around in Havana in these wonderful cars. Yes, it is. They have put a lot of money since the Russians left. They were desperate for money, and the government decided that a quick fix was to open up the island and bring in tourism, and it worked.
No,
the 90s.
Let me stop
there
now. So tourism works. Now, why you say that the island is old? The Russians left it a mess, and still people are finding it fascinating. What makes it so fascinating? I mean, so yeah, old cars riding around, but there must be something else that you would say is really an incredible thing for Cuba, really fascinating.
Well, you have to remember that in Cuba's history, back in the 1500s, 500 years ago, Havana was an extremely wealthy port. You had gold and silver coming in from Mexico, and you had the slave trade coming in from Africa. So it was a very wealthy city, and the remnants of it are still there. And the architecture is just something that is unique and different. Some of the hotels, the five-star hotels, may have been a palace of a former count, which they have refurbished. They are very careful about, especially in the tourist area where the old Capitol building is, and downtown, the old part of the city. They are working very hard to preserve that whole area. And I have traveled in Central America. I've been to Dominican Republic, and I've been to parts of South America, and have traveled to their old cities, if you will. But there is nothing, in my opinion, that compares to Havana. If you really want to understand Spanish history and its commerce, Havana is the place to go. And they have marvelous museums now that tell it all.
Now, that's a very interesting thing, Anita, that they have these wonderful museums. I would have thought that the Soviets would have done something to the art and, really taken it away.
No,
they left it, huh?
Basically, I think the relationship with Russia, with Cuba, was basically, it was a barter system. The Cubans put all their eggs in one basket, which was Russia. And what they were after, it was sugar for oil. And that was kind of the deal. There is, in one section outside of Havana, where the Russians lived, there's a whole apartment complex, but it's more or less empty today. It's since the Russians left.
Right.
So, no, the museum, the Belle Arts Museum, when we went to see it in '92, was really a miserable shambles. Of course, back in '92, when we went, they had no electricity. The city was dark. It was black.
Wow.
Except for a few spots where electricity was allowed. So on our first trip, when we did go in and we were advised to go to the Belle Arts Museum, it was literally a one light bulb situation. There was no air conditioning. And a lot of the artwork was in this hot, dirty, rundown building. But they have repaired it, and they've restored it, and it's a beautiful museum today. Most of the artwork was cleaned up and restored.
Right.
It's fully remodeled, air-conditioned, and everything else. It's a gorgeous museum, actually.
Right. Now, in your bio, I mentioned that you were very interested in meeting artists. Why is that?
Well, we were both that was our interest. So we thought, well, this is an opportunity. Let's see if we can't find some artists, and if we find something interesting, invest in it. And that's exactly what we did. I have to tell you that in over the years, I've been in and out of Cuba for around 60 times, if not more. So when we met these artists, we became very good friends. So it wasn't only just buying their artwork, but it was also it extended here to the United States, where we were able to get these artists out of Cuba. And actually, we did have shows here at Old School Square, and my husband was responsible in introducing Latin American art, actually, to Old School Square. And they were beautiful exhibits. They were wonderful.
Now, when you brought the art to America, what kind of art was it? Was it abstract art? Was it more like an impressionist art? What is the difference between Latin American art and the art that we're used to seeing in museums?
Oh, well, that's kind of hard to describe. A lot of the Cuban artwork has Santeria in it. To go on another tangent, even though Cuba is Catholic, it is predominantly, and I would say that more than 50% of the Cubans, if not all, believe in Santeria.
You got to describe Santeria, Anita, to our audience. Some people may know, some people may not know, but I know it is a very interesting phenomena, the whole notion of what Santeria is.
Well, it's a religion. It's a cult type of thing. And some of it has African roots. And if you have, like I have an artwork that is basically, it looks like there's a Catholic Saint Lazarus, is that his name? And he's asleep. But as the artist explained it to me, he's on his way. This is not Saint Lazarus with the dogs. It's basically Lobo, which is an African god, and he's sleeping on his way going back to Africa. So it's that kind of a theme. Now some of the pieces that I have are different. They're not Santeria. They are pop art. Some of them are abstract expressionism. And some of the paintings that were in the 90s that we saw, a lot of the artists were making political statements. And you'll find back in the 90s, there was an awful lot of that. The artists were able to get away with expressing their feelings about the government. Oh yeah. Now, so you have a combination of everything, and then they have the classical art that was very much influenced by Europe, and so it's a range. Right.
Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the artists that you met and why you found them so fascinating and so talented. You chose certain kinds of art, so there must have been a reason for that. So let's tell our audience a little bit about some of the artists and what it was like to kind of be able to have the opportunity to buy their art. I mean, it must have been a phenomenal experience for you.
Well, you buy the art basically because you like the artist.
Okay.
You like the person
more than the art itself.
Yeah, and then the art kind of falls in place too. The very first artist, I have to tell you how this all started. It began with my husband going out on the street, and he actually was a cigar smoker, and he did find somebody that would get him Cuban cigars. And with that, Jay asked, he said, gee, we're here looking, we would like to meet some artists. Do you know anybody that would help us, take us around and meet some of these artists? And, of course, in Cuba, and we got to know it, everything is no problem. And so, yes, the little cigar dealer knew a photographer named Roberto who had a car, but we would have to buy the gasoline, but he knew where they lived, and that's how it all started. So we piled into the car, and we went through the back streets of Havana all over and really saw basically what Havana was like in 1992. So Roberto stopped at these houses and then just knocked on the door and said, there's some crazy Americans here who want to buy artwork.
Right.
Would you like to meet them? And so that's how it all started.
That's amazing.
And then it snowballed. I mean, it went from one artist to another, and we came back, of course, on a high, and we did our homework, and we discovered that the one artist that we befriended was really a Cuban master, and we had no idea.
Oh.
So you come back and you do your homework, and then on the second trip, we went back in, and Jay called this particular artist and said, we're here, we'd like to see you again. And he said, okay, bring me a bottle of scotch. And we
there you go.
We did. So that's how really basically it all started. And then it spread out into Miami, because there are a lot of Cuban artists who, live in and around Miami.
Mm-hmm.
So the connections, it just one thing kept leading into another. And our interests and our friendships, it just grew into helping these artists live. Exhibiting their artwork. We brought a lot of their artwork out, sold it, and gave the money back to them to help them live. The embargo does not touch the arts. And even back in 92, we didn't know it then, but I think 2 or 3 years later, we understood you could take out art and bring it into the United States. So that's another story. That's how it was permitted. But the arts are not affected by the embargo.
Now, why is it, you hear about a lot of Cubans, especially the ones in Miami, who left Cuba, and they were musicians, they were jazz artists, they were, as you said, they were painters, they were, sculptors. Is there something about the mentality of the people in Cuba that makes them so very, very good with all of the arts? What is it about them?
Well, I think Cuba is just an island of just tons of creativity, and I think that their isolation for many, many years only made them more creative. If you think about it, what kept the Cubans going, basically, in living in those hard times? They called it the special period for 20 years after the Russians left, and how they had to get their act together, how they had to relearn how to farm, do everything to feed themselves. Mm-hmm. But what really kept the island together and the people was their culture, and quite frankly, it was their music. Their music is just world-renowned today.
Right.
But when you visit Cuba, even today, there is some kind of combo on every corner playing something, and they're all quite good. So it was their music, and it was that's what kept their spirit going.
Right. Now that things have changed, of course, we want to talk a little bit about the people who are running the government. Are they interested in bringing more artists, more arts to their communities, and are they optimistic about their future? It seems that for a long time, the people in Miami were very angry and very hostile to the Cuban politicians. Could you tell us a little bit about the Cuban politicians and whether they're going to make sure that Cuba is the Cuba from when? From 1954?
Well, I think what I think the island people do not want, and I think the average person on the island feels this way. What I'm saying is really kind of what I'm expressing, okay? It's not an overall opinion here. I do think that a lot of people want their island left alone. They don't want American interference.
Oh.
Even though they want, basically the people, to do business, to trade and to do other things, they don't want America interfering with their politics. How and which way Cuba is going to go, I do not know. Certainly Fidel has died, but I don't think things are going to drastically change right away.
Right.
If anything, and again I'm expressing my own opinion, I think that they will probably or will try to have some form of government that is on the Chinese model. They're going to still have a strong government. They'll give more to the people and that type of thing, but the government still wants control.
So you're telling me that they really want to be communists?
Well, you mean to be communist? Is that what you said?
Yeah, because what are the Chinese?
Well, I think that, yes, I think they want to still be a very strong socialistic type of government, but I'm not so sure that that is going to work because they're 90 miles off of our shore, and America, has a lot of influence, culturally as well. We have our technology, and those are all kinds of things that the young people want too. So they're kind of in flux right now. I have no idea, but my guess is that yes, they are going to try to keep it on a role model like China is doing today.
I hear you. Now, the artists that you met, their art must have been extremely inexpensive when you got involved in buying it. And today, I wonder, what's it like? Is it very, very expensive? Is it
well, it kind of, again, it's very interesting. Jay and I got into Cuba at a very unusual time period. And there are people and galleries in Coral Gables today that have, Cuban art. Some of it is the classical, some from the classical period, the 50s to 60s. And it was very interesting. We started, I guess our reputation got pretty well known in Coral Gables because some of these Cubans whose family fled Cuba, either in the 60s or the 80s, wanted basically to represent Cuban artists. And even though they thought these families that they couldn't go back to Cuba and didn't want to do it because of the government and this, that, and the other thing, a lot of the galleries today down there are representing island artists. And it's very interesting. So again, the arts are flowing in and out of Cuba between, Miami, Coral Gables, and, Cuba.
Right.
So it's very interesting. So there's one, I don't want to mention names, but after our experiences, she started going back and looking for these artists, and she is representing them today.
Right. So it sounds like they're probably doing pretty good. Now, this is something else that I am interested in, and I have a feeling that a lot of people who will be listening to this show would want to ask you. Trump has closed the borders, particularly for Mexico. Do you think he's going to try to do that with Cuba?
No, Cuba has always had a special, I don't know what they call it. It's a special something where if any Cuban leaves their shores in a boat and can make it to the United States, they stay. So they get special treatment. They they will get health care. They will get, I think, almost green cards and that kind of stuff. They have a special status. The Cubans are different.
Yeah, their medical system in Cuba has always been good. People have told me that some of the docs and some of the people who work in the medical field are really superior. Is that true?
Yes, they do have a very good medical thing. That's one of the things that the government did. They wanted to make sure that the kids were educated, which they do. Their education is free, and their medical facilities are wonderful. They do lack medications and maybe some, high-tech, equipment and that type of thing.
Right.
But a couple of years ago, they do have a good cancer program. A couple of years ago, we took friends out to the Hemingway house, and there were a couple of young kids there. They were ranged from 8 to maybe 16. There were about 10 of them. Mm-hmm. And they all had, they were all bald. And it turned out that they were kids from Grenoble who were affected by, the explosion of the nuclear plant in the Ukraine. And they were in Russia getting treatment.
Really?
So, yes, they do. So, yes, they do. And they've had some of their doctors have been overseas to South Africa for helping with their AIDS epidemic. They were in Angola. Yeah, so their medical doctors do travel the world over.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're almost at the end of the show, and I always like to ask my guests, if you had a last word, what would you want to talk about? What would you want to tell our audience about? Because you know so much about Cuba, and we've talked about some of their arts, and we've talked a little bit about their politics. But, Anita, think of this as a little book. What would you write in the book about Cuba and your experiences?
Well, I'm an art. My background is in art, and I like history. I think that this small island has had so much to offer that it is an amazing little place to go and visit. And I think that there is just so much wonderful, both art and history combined, that it is tremendous to see. Now, they have cruise ships going in there now that go around the island for different ports. And I think it's well worthwhile to see. And I say right now, go before the embargo really is lifted, because you don't have a McDonald's there.
Right.
And I think it's just, it's a special little spot in the Caribbean that hasn't been discovered, although that's not true. Mm-hmm. Their tourism is over 3 million a year.
Yeah, they're booming.
And the people are coming in from all over. But it's just so unique in where it's at in the timeline. And I think it's very interesting to see now before the embargo is lifted,
right.
Because it's going to change tremendously. I mean, when the embargo is lifted.
Yeah.
And this is just a gem of a little place to go visit. It's just chock full with all kinds of wonderful things, and the food is delicious too.
Yeah.
So,
now, I know that I just said this is the last thing, but I can't help but asking. So if people were to learn something from the Cubans, who had a pretty hard time, a lot of poverty and not so much food, and all the troubles that they went through, because of the Soviets, and what would you tell them is so special about the Cubans that they were able to get past that? And they were able to even love the arts. I mean, because, boy, when you're having a tough life, you would think that people would be, very depressed or very...
Well, they are. I mean, the people are. There's no question about it. some people do have a real hard time. The one thing that keeps the people afloat, and those are those families down in Cuba who have relatives who live in Miami. Those people who live in Miami go back to the island quite a bit, and they bring a lot of money and a lot of other things that they cannot get on the island to help them stay afloat. It is not an easy way of life at all. And of course, there's more extra money. If they can be entrepreneurial, they're allowed to have small restaurants in their home. There are beauty parlors that are beginning to appear, small businesses and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And the government is encouraging that because they can't support them. So there are ways in which they can get around. The island people are very creative. What else is keeping that island afloat is the black market. So, they're clever and smart, and they've had to be in order to survive.
Right.
So, yeah, it hasn't been a very easy life, that is for sure. But I do think that the artists live better because they have access. They can sell their artwork, and they do have to give something back to the government on it, like a tax. But basically, their standard of living is much higher than the average Cuban.
Right. Well, I have to say, Anita, that you started us thinking and started us giving us so much little or so much information. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you about that. My suspicion is that people will want to travel to Cuba because, as you just said, it's a place where it's back in time, and people are looking for that, aren't they? So I want to say right now that we have covered a little bit, and so maybe at some point we might want to do something again. So thank you so much, Anita Hyman, for being on the Susan Brender Show.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Susan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.